Hello and welcome to today's webcast, How to Deliver Secure, Performant, and Resilient Digital Government Services. I'm Deb Snyder, Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Government, and I'm excited to serve as your host for today's webcast. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next 30 minutes. We have just a few housekeeping notes for you right there on the screen. We'll be emailing a recording of this presentation to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use that recording for your reference, or feel free to pass it along to your colleagues using the share widget right there in the console menu. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. All right, joining me today to discuss this topic are Scotty Ray, Head of U.S. Public Sector Solution Engineering for Cloudflare, and Morgan Wright, Senior Fellow at the Center for Digital Government. Welcome, Scotty and Morgan. We're very pleased to have you both with us today.
Great to be here.
Yep, as always.
Okay, before we get started, we have a brief poll for you, our audience, just to better understand the challenges you face regarding today's topic, so our speakers can ensure that they focus in on those approaches that address your concerns and pain points. So help us out with this question. What is your organization's biggest challenge in delivering secure digital services? Is it managing the cybersecurity threats, ransomware, phishing, and so on? Is it ensuring a seamless services delivery and performance during high traffic times? Maybe it's consolidating your legacy systems with modern cloud architectures, or training and preparing your staff for hybrid work environments. Or maybe it's budget constraints and lack of resources. Everyone knows that government never has enough. So go ahead and enter your responses. And Scotty, Morgan, while we wait for our audience to submit their thoughts, from your perspective, what are the topmost concerns and pain points that you see government organizations struggling with in delivering secure services?
Yeah, so I think, obviously, I think there's multiple challenges. I think some of the things where we see is that there's trying to think about what we're trying to solve for first. Like, what is the service that we're trying to deliver, and working our way backwards from not only a deployment methodology, but a support and operational, methodology. And so when we look at like moving services, creating them digitally, are we going to be hosting them? Are we moving that? I think oftentimes we get focused on the tech, and we don't necessarily think about what that experience is going to be. Morgan, I think you and I've talked about this, in sort of the run up to this, right? But I think it's all about we need to focus on what we're solving for and let that inform some of the decisions that we make leading up to it.
And before you give those answers, Deb, I would like to point out to everybody, we are only days away from an election, and think about, I think all 5 of those things apply to every Secretary of State office, all the counties, right? We've got cybersecurity threats. We've got threats from Russia, China, Iran. We need to ensure seamless delivery. We've got a lot of systems that we're consolidating into the cloud. So yeah, depending on where you're at, but it's like Scotty and I were talking about, begin with the end in mind. Stephen Covey, there are a lot of basic business principles that apply to cybersecurity. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And guess what? You don't have to solve every problem, but if you don't understand the priority of your problems, because you've only got so much budget, so many resources, solve for the big rocks first, because that's going to have the biggest impact for your organization.
It's really about knowing what to prioritize and put first. Right, exactly. All right, so let's take a look at what our audience feels. It looks like managing cybersecurity threats right out there in front, and I can't say that I blame them. It is just an incredibly intense time. Consolidating the legacy systems looks to be fairly nearly tied with training and preparing staff for hybrid work environments, and ensuring a seamless delivery is bringing up the final concern. So right on target. All right, let's get started. So we all know that government organizations are under increasing pressure. Morgan, you pointed this out. Scotty, your point's well taken as well. And in trying to deliver these world-class digital services, at the same time delivering an outstanding user experience, all the while managing increasing demand, rising cyber threats, adapting to new hybrid work environments, and more. As more services move online, organizations have to find ways to reduce costs and simplify their operations. Consolidating outdated systems into hybrid multi-cloud architectures offers a solution, but doing so, we know, can also introduce new security and performance challenges. So today we're going to explore how public sector agencies can leverage a platform-based approach, can seamlessly navigate that shift to digital services without compromising on efficiency, security, and simplicity. All right, my first question, Scotty, is for you. How can organizations balance the need for digital innovation while ensuring the security of sensitive data in a hybrid multi-cloud environment?
I think the word that I would typically start out with is intentionality. So when we look at how we want to deliver a user-centric experience, whether we're rolling out a modern, sim, when we think about data governance and data protection, we have to come at it from an intentionality perspective. And what I mean by that is we need to actually organize to determine what, like a data literacy program, so that we understand exactly what the data is, what the impact of that data, getting out or potentially leaking or being exfilled, and then where is that data sourced, and how does the application or the service that we're trying to roll out for our citizens or our constituency, how does that interact with it, especially as we think about sort of this increasingly interconnectedness of both SaaS applications or public data sources, or even new models of applications that might leverage external sources out. So how is that data touched? Where does it live? If I take this piece of data and put it with that piece of data, do I now create something that, that creates even a more sensitive, risk if that were to be exfilled or put out there? So I think intentionality is the first step of the equation. We can talk about the controls and how we should look at the controls of the platform, and I think we'll get into that. But I think first step is always like, what is the data? Where is it? When I combine these data sets together, and be intentional about the design of that service that we're trying to roll out. And then you can kind of work backwards from that as to the controls and the architectures that you want to do to prevent the things that we're most worried about from a risk perspective.
Yeah, that wraps it up nicely. Intentionality in delivering a user-centric experience, that purposeful design mindset. Morgan, any thoughts?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to, I'm going to sound like I'm a broken record, but begin with the end in mind. But a lot of this deals with policy too, right? Too many people are ready, fire, aim. We got to get something, and we saw this during COVID. We just have to build something. We got to get something out there, and now we're paying the price for not slowing down, taking a breath, and thinking intentionality, right? What is it we really want to do? What's the problem we're trying to solve? So I think a lot of this gets into policies, gets into governance, as you were saying, policy and governance. Establish those things early so that as you build your tech platform, because policy and governance don't involve tech. They involve process, they involve methodology, they involve other parts of your organization, the business part, the HR part, the logistical part, right? So but the one thing we talked about too is sensitive data. I'm a big fan too of going through and asking for each piece of data you're collecting, what's the purpose why are we collecting this piece of data, and what purpose does it serve? Too many people say, well, let's collect everything because we never know when we're going to need it. Well, that's like a man who keeps that piece of lumber in his garage for 6 years ago. I finally found a reason for this piece of lumber, right? But I'm saying, but when a breach happens, and unfortunately breaches happen all too often, and something's going to happen, then it's about limiting exposure, and it's limiting risk to the citizens and to the data, right? So even look at your data. If it's sensitive data, just start interrogating and say, why are we collecting it? What's the purpose for it? If we took this piece of data away, could we still perform our job? Could we still do the things to deliver services? Because we got to get down to Occam's razor. Sometimes the simplest explanation suffices.
I like that point. I mean, not only, what do we collect, what purpose does it have, but how long do we need to keep it once it's met its purpose? Do we need to store it? Yeah, absolutely.
Like that piece of lumber. I mean, you guys are going to be thinking about that. It's like that piece of lumber, right?
I have someone in mind when you said that. Morgan, let's go to you with the next question. With cyber threats evolving rapidly as governments transition to more public-facing digital services, what can organizations do to better protect sensitive data to assure availability, resiliency, without disrupting ongoing services delivery?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my broken record, begin with the end in mind, establish your policy and governance. But I think the other thing too is, speaking of intentionality, how does that apply to this? You also have to be intentional about your budget. If you are spending, remember in our pre-call, we were talking about vulnerable systems in Windows SMB 1.1, WannaCry, stuff that had been out of life, for 3 years. At some point, you have to realize there's cost and price. Cost is a one-time thing, price is a lifetime thing. So as you're thinking about these, what is the cost of maintaining this versus the price of maintaining this? A lot of people are still using legacy types of protection, legacy types of approaches, when they ought to be modernizing. The reason they say, well, we can't modernize because it costs too much money. No, the cost when it goes down, as I testified before Congress on healthcare.gov, I learned a line from that I've used ever since. And Deb, you'll follow me on this, right? Government always says, we never seem to find the time and money to do it right, but when something happens, we find the time and money to do it over. And when we do it over, guess what the cost is? The cost is 10x higher, 20x higher, right? So a lot of this gets in if you're going to protect, as these threats evolve a lot of times faster than our ability to adapt to them. So we have to be a little bit more forward thinking, be flexible in our frameworks and our architectures. But I think really one of the ways to do it is to really be careful about the type of data that you're collecting, but think about investing. You've got technical debt out there that people are still trying to overcome. You cannot spend your way out of it. At some point, you've got to make that hard cut over. You got to get to new things that are going to protect you. So part of that's the budget process, but part of it's political will, right? Can you make the business case to say, if we keep doing it this way, we're just dying the death of 1,000 cuts. We've got to make this hard cut over. It's going to be inconvenient for a couple months, but guess what? It's going to serve us for the next 5 years much better.
Yeah, current tools, current solutions for current innovation and current problems, right? Absolutely. All right, so moving on. Scotty, I want to come back to you and talk about some of the most significant challenges and pitfalls that you see leaders struggling with when they're consolidating their outdated legacy systems into these hybrid and multi-cloud architectures.
Yeah, so it builds a little bit on what Morgan was just talking about there, is that I think oftentimes when we talk about rolling out the services and the changes that we want to do with that, whether we're looking at a cloud-based offering or digitizing that offering for that, we look at the service and we look at the application, but we don't look at the set of controls around it in the same way. So what you end up happening is, as organizations, let's say that for whatever reason they want to roll out a new service and they want to put it in the cloud because they believe that the cloud is going to give them, and when I say the cloud, the public cloud is going to give them maybe a better resiliency or a better scale or a better reach. And at the same time, but they're not thinking about the fact that we built this legacy set of security controls when we were hosting it or running in a data center, and now I'm moving it there. And then the set of controls is an afterthought because we think that, well, if I know how to secure it here, that the same sort of tools and capabilities apply when I host this in a different environment, or if I'm hosting it in a bimodal fashion where I've got maybe a portion of it in the cloud and maybe a backup or resilient, site or offering of it in a data center. I think what we need to do is we need to start thinking about things more holistically. So if I look at the way these threat vectors are evolving, it's a more distributed threat vector. It's a more global threat vector. And the bad guys, they only need to be right once. The good guys have to be right every single time. And so if I'm looking at adopting and migrating to a cloud-oriented architecture or a new digital-oriented architecture, security, performance, reliability, like that needs to be thought of as a part of it. So, we hear things like CISA secure by design, and we think these, like, there's still a bifurcation where we say, hey, here's my service, and we throw it over the fence to a network and security operations or an architecture team and go, how do I secure it? And it really should be brought together as a team so that as we make these moves, we're also adopting the same kinds of capabilities. Like our security should be a cloud offering if our platform, right, is a cloud offering, right? If we're leveraging AI or ML or some of these new technologies, right, to enhance the way in which we deliver a service, how are we leveraging these capabilities to actually protect against the cyber threat, landscape that's out there? And so we need to be unified, not just in what we're delivering, but how we're surrounding what we're delivering from a security and a performance and a resiliency perspective.
So
hey, let me throw out one piece to that real quick, Deb.
Go ahead.
As you move to cloud, a lot of people say, well, we're in the cloud, like that solves their problem. There's a whole new discipline now. It's come out the last 2 to 3 years called cloud security posture management, right? Once you get it into the cloud, to your point, Scotty, earlier, there's a whole different set of controls, right? You just can't, what got you here will not get you there. So as you think about this, just simply going to saying, well, we solved it, we went to the cloud. That's only the beginning of your journey, So
Right.
Think of things like cloud security posture management. Once you get there, be intentional again about the controls you apply, because guess what? A lot of systems were not designed to connect to the internet. I mean, I think about the energy attack that happened in December 23rd, 2015 in Kiev, Ukraine, when they attacked the power plants. These systems were connected by serial to Ethernet connectors. They were never designed to connect to the internet. So there's a whole, whole school of thought in these hybrid environments. Like, first of all, does it need to be connected, right? So those are questions you need to ask.
Mm. And there's that skills gap issue that you've both sort of alluded to, right? The retraining and upskilling of your workforce for this new operational normal, not to mention enterprise visibility, the holy grail of security that we all, chase after. So, so Morgan, let's go to you on this next one. What strategies can government agencies use to maintain high performance, availability for online services, especially when they're dealing with high traffic or crisis? You mentioned elections, for instance.
Yeah, there is no one simple or easy answer to this. I think one of the things you have to do is, again, establish policy and governance. What's your plan, right? You always have to have a plan. If something's going on, when you need to maintain high performance, there's two issues to that. One is your technology investment, right? Have you overcome your technical debt? Have you invested properly? But the other thing is, and this always happens, the law of unintended consequences. When something happens, do you have a plan to handle this incident? Do you have a plan to handle this? It could be, as we saw when the storms came through, when you think about Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, there's a lot of failures that everybody has disaster planning. Very few people have catastrophe planning, but you still have to have these plans in place, right? So when you think about maintaining performance, a lot of that is, I think, Scotty, you were saying that too, are we distributed enough, right? If something happens in one area, are we able to fail over to another area and maintain it? But that also gets into, Deb, you mentioned the word earlier too, prioritization, right? At some point, I can address anything, I just can't address everything. So when something happens and we start getting into that mode of high priority, what are the high priority services? Have I got those properly identified to say, I don't need to know what the level of my water cooler is, and the water in the break room, not that you have a sensor for that. And if you do, God bless you, but I would suggest against that. But you've got to be, is it your payroll system? Is it your HR system? Is it, whatever system it is? You've got to think about your priorities. What needs to be prioritized first? Think of a fire, right? You've got 10 buildings and only enough water to save 5 of those buildings. Mm-hmm. What are the 5 buildings that absolutely must be saved in times of crisis?
Absolutely, that order of priority and restoration and response, so important. All right, so Scotty, anything to add to that? Any other strategies that Morgan missed in terms of high performance and availability?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Morgan touched on it, but again, I sound like a broken record, but distribution is the key in my opinion today. Like so many of the the controls and accelerations that we use in legacy environments were centered on a box or an appliance or a single choke point, right? Or maybe a handful of choke points where those policy enforcement points would be. In order to sort of distribute and keep things performant and actually do protection, I think in the day and age today, where most of these attacks are completely, globally distributed, like our protections, our accelerations, our visibility has to be equally as distributed. And so the more of these architectures that we can put in place that can be the same architecture that will handle both things that maybe are in the cloud and things that are in a data center or that are in a branch. If I can have a platform or an architectural approach that can go cross domain, if you will, or bimodal, if you will, across how I'm delivering those, that's going to be the key, I think, in being successful. But instead of trying to manage a separate, set of controls for these types of things and another set of controls for these types of things and another set of controls, because government just doesn't have the budget or the time, frankly, or the personnel to not manage. It's hard enough to manage multiple different application environments. But if I also have to manage separate tech stacks and separate, sets of controls for each one of those environments, you create this sort of operational toil in the environment. And we're not really, unifying the way in which we enforce, define policy and performance and resiliency.
Absolutely. Great point. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about something you've both mentioned, the user experience specifically. How can organizations ensure that seamless experience, right, when citizens are accessing digital services, especially those with limited technical proficiencies?
So I'll take a first pass at this. How many people do not have one of these in this day and age?
One or more.
Right? Yeah, one or more. But I think the other thing too, it's generational. We were talking, and we have a fantastic person from eRepublic, Chelsea, who's helping us handle this. True millennials, she says, but true millennials tend to not do things with pencil and paper. They're not. It's about the web. It's what can I do on my mobile experience. I think a lot of this designing the right experience is also generational. Do we have the right experience, and can we allow them to pick based on the generation they are? Folks like me who are baby boomers, or some of the Gen Z, you might have older folks too that are more comfortable in a web-based environment. But I think you hit upon it. It's the experience. Do what Steve Jobs said, because we were having the Mac versus PC discussion before we started. And I'm a Mac guy, but what Steve Jobs said, begin with the experience first and work backwards from that. Don't invent something and then try and figure out how to make it fit in, right? What's the experience they need? What's the result you want out of them having that experience? So a lot of this, I mean, again, it starts with the concept of operations. What do we want it to look like? I'm working on a project right now. I've got a grant from the Department of Justice. I'm building out some stuff about how to share tip information and connect to cases. But we're spending an awful lot of time before we even start building the app on the user experience. We're wireframing. We're looking at what kind of information needs to be there. It's really beginning with that experience in mind and working back from that, because guess what? Pro tip, if they don't like the experience the first time they come there, they will not use it the second or third time. There'll be a way. What you want is that experience that brings them in and keeps them in and keeps them consuming your services.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'll maybe add on to that a little bit too. I think the overcorrection that sometimes happens. I know we've been talking a lot about intentionality and this. I think one of the challenges I've seen with some of it is that we sometimes over pivot and we allow perfect to be the enemy of good. And in this day and age, when we're talking about getting, more citizen services, more government services out there, I think we can over pivot and we spend so much time in the analysis that we actually don't ever do anything. And I think there's a spectrum there that we can operate on, where we definitely need to be intentional. We need to think about what it is that we're trying to deliver. But with a lot of these modern application architectures, they give us the ability to iterate really, really fast. And so we can deploy something out there, we can provide a certain experience, and actually ingest feedback from the experience from those that we're serving, and then kind of iterate on top of that. When we have those types of, let's call them cloud native types of application architectures and deployments, the other side of that equation is we should also be deploying the controls and the acceleration capabilities of that experience need to be as cloud native. In other words, they need to be as adaptable, as iterative, so that we're not, we're accelerating both the service and the things that we want to put around the service, to make sure that we're being operationally responsible, protecting data, enforcing that governance, accelerating the resiliency of that service. Both of those, I think, we need to start to do stuff as opposed to wait, because the longer we wait sometimes because we're trying to get everything perfect, I think that we're waiting, and guess what? The threat vectors, the risk, if you will, continues to advance. It doesn't wait. And so sometimes not doing anything can actually be as bad as putting something out there that may not be the 100% solution or the 100% optimal experience.
Right. One of the things we learned in COVID is that it was a great innovation driver, right? It was like the whip on the back, but designing with generationality in mind and mapping that journey, working backwards from there, and then deploying and fine tuning iteratively, all just a great model to get things out there and innovate at the rapid speed that we need to. So Scotty, as governments adopt hybrid work environments, specifically, what steps can they take to secure remote access while maintaining efficiency?
I think some of the biggest things that we're starting to see out there is the evolution to, and there's a lot of different terminologies out there. Certainly, I think historically what we did was we put big inbound listeners right in certain places. People would connect through sort of legacy technologies like VPNs, and we throw them on the network, and it's like, hey, just get me here. And then once I'm here, then it'll be like I'm on the network because I am on the network and I can go. And I think we've seen an evolution of a lot of different capabilities around what the industry referred to as sort of a zero trust network access solution, where we can provide more direct user to service through cloud delivered models, right? Where we're not actually putting users on the network anymore, but we're taking a look at their identity and their posture and their context and throwing a policy framework to connect them either to private resources or potentially to SaaS offerings or other authorized, integrated access solutions. I think that as we get more bimodal in terms of data center versus cloud and hybrid clouds, we need to make sure that we're also updating and modernizing and looking at. I really need to start defining policies that dictate this class of user or this specific user really only needs access to this resource and under these contexts, and putting in a technology framework around that helps enforce it. I think I always laugh, like everybody wants to talk about zero trust, and obviously it's one of those things. In my opinion, like in 68, the principle of least privilege was codified, I think, for the first time in a document, like, at MIT. This is really the same thing. It's just now leveraging some advancements in technical capabilities to enforce least privilege. I should only have access to the things that I need to have access to when I need to have access to them. And I think that as we look at governments going across these different environments, the platforms or the tool sets that you use to enforce that framework have got to be adaptable to all of those different environments. We can't use legacy mindsets, legacy point solutions. We have to start looking at more holistic platforms that can intersect with a variety of these different endpoints and services that we're connecting to.
Morgan?
Yeah, I'll just add on to it real quick because I know we're going to be running short of time. But he was talking about zero trust, so really about micro-segmentation, but also getting into authentication, right? Hackers don't break in anymore; they log in. So the protection of identity, multi-factor, moving to FIDO2, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can take that. What you want to do is raise the cost of an attack, transfer it back onto the attacker, so they pay a tax, they pay a penalty for attempting to compromise your organization. But I'm telling you right now, the number one way to get in, it's still things like phishing and spear phishing, the number one tactic of state sponsors. But identity is key. You've got to establish, and that's what it's all about, establishing identity. And to your point, Scotty, can I trust you? And if I trust you, to what extent do I trust you? And what do I give you access to based on that trust?
Yep.
Absolutely. I mean, in my opinion, zero trust is simply defense in depth and least privilege 2.0, right? Just in time, just enough. All right. So one final question, if I might. What role does AI and machine learning play in enhancing resiliency and performance of government digital services, particularly with cyber?
So I'll go first to give Scotty the last word here because he's our guest of honor. So I tell you, we talked about it earlier, but it's the reskilling people. But you know what? We're facing a human resource crisis, a human capital crisis. We don't have the people, the technology. So I see things like AI and large language models being able to close that gap to give people new capabilities, new skills to also play in cybersecurity. Imagine me spending 10 minutes with you, teaching you just simply how to ask the right questions of the data to get your answer, like which machines are vulnerable to this CVE, to this exploit, to this, and having the AI, the large language model, interrogate the data for you and bring the results, as opposed to who wants to be a SOC analyst sitting there dying from, your eyes are bleeding because you're reading line after line in a spreadsheet. So I think AI has a lot of capability to help us close the tech gap, the technology gap, the human skills gap, the human capital gap. We've got a lot of people, as you know, Deb, from your time in state and local government, retiring out. Where are we going to find people to fill these positions? And I think AI helps, and especially from a cybersecurity standpoint, attacks are happening at machine speed. We have to be able to respond at machine speed to these attacks. And humans are a poor first line of defense. We've always been, but we still have cognitive abilities. AI still doesn't, but we have to learn how to use those. But I think as AI becomes the first line of defense in large language models, it's going to be a game changer.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think Morgan said it perfectly. I'll add a couple of things. The thing that scares me most about AI is the fact that it lowers the bar for the non-sophisticated person that has an ill intent to actually execute at a sophisticated fashion. And so if I have, like Morgan's saying, if I have a platform that can leverage these machine learning types of AIs to identify those patterns and identify them in a more programmatic fashion and do it at a global scale, because that's the threat that we face, that becomes a key ingredient to ensuring that our cyber protections are in fact automated on the front line before we get to the tier 2, the tier 3, the human expertise that's there. I mean, I really don't have much to add to what Morgan said. I think he captured it perfectly.
Excellent. All right, so we're almost at the end of our time together. Could you just take a minute, each of you, to summarize any final thoughts, any golden nuggets you want to leave our audience with? We'll start with you, Morgan, and Scotty, again, you'll bring up the last word.
I'll make this very quick. When we were talking earlier about, when to start, just remember, if you wait to go on vacation till all the traffic lights are green, you'll never get started. So get started, do something now. And if I were going to give you one book to read that gets into that mindset of doing things that are good enough, bending the curve down, Clayton Christensen, called The Innovator's Dilemma. He's the one who helped develop the thought around creating the Celeron processor, because the Pentium was too expensive, but they identified a class of people to where a Celeron would be good enough for the operations they were doing. So think through that. What's good enough to accomplish what we need to do? And like Scotty says, don't wait till you got perfect. Perfect costs too much, and it usually fails because it was built in more of a waterfall method rather than an agile, and it's not going to be as adaptable.
Excellent. Scotty?
Yeah, I would just go back to the beginning and say that let's figure out the problems that we're trying to solve, right? What are the services that we're trying to roll out? Why are we trying to roll them out in new and more modern ways? And what's the benefit to the customer? And in our case, when we're talking about customer, our customer is the citizen. It's the constituency, right? It's the person that's living in our counties and in our states and the capabilities that they need. We need to start with them in mind and start with the things that we need to deliver for them and then work backwards, right? And that's the kind of engagements that I have with my customers when we start talking about what is it that we're bringing to the citizens, and we start from there. It becomes really an easier process to actually deliver upon the goal here of, right, an increasingly digital and modern government citizen experience.
Tremendously helpful advice for the audience. I want to be respectful of our time commitments, so we're going to wrap it up here. In closing, I'd just like to thank you both, Scotty, Morgan, for sharing your insights on today's webcast. I'd also like to thank Cloudflare for making it possible to have this important discussion today. And of course, thanks to you, our audience, for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you soon again at another Government Technology event. For Government Technology, I'm Deb Snyder. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Scotty. Thanks, Morgan.
Thanks, everybody.